Bonjour à tous et bienvenue dans cette deuxième interview de la Fabrique sociale que j'ai faite avec Zuckerman, donc, qui est un professeur de sciences politiques aux États-Unis, un écrivain, et c'est aussi un activiste d'Internet depuis des années. Donc, il a beaucoup réfléchi à d'éventuelles alternatives aux réseaux sociaux actuels. Donc, il avait toute sa place sur la chaîne La Fabrique sociale. C'est aussi, pour l'anecdote, celui qui a inventé la pub pop-up. Voilà. N'hésitez pas à me dire ce que vous pensez du format interview dans les commentaires, puisque c'est un nouveau format, donc il y a probablement encore beaucoup de choses à améliorer. Si vous avez des idées d'invités, de potentiels invités, donnez-les-moi aussi dans les commentaires. Et si vous souhaitez soutenir financièrement cette chaîne, qui en a grand besoin, parce que cette chaîne n'est absolument pas indépendante financièrement aujourd'hui, vous pouvez me le faire directement via le lien Tipeee qui est dans les commentaires. Et puis, j'espère que vous apprécierez cette interview. Ciao, ciao. Thank you, Ethan, for being with us. It's a real pleasure. My first question will be, how would you describe yourself and how would you describe your work?
Sure. These days, I'm a professor. I teach at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I teach in 3 departments. I teach public policy, communication, and information. My background, though, is not as a scholar. My background really is as someone who has been building internet and social media tools, and as someone who's been trying to use the internet for global inclusion. I've worked on projects for 30 years now with a focus on helping people in the global south and the developing world be part of conversations through the internet. So maybe I'm a reluctant professor. My work now focuses on the idea that we need to think of digital tools as public goods. We can't just hand over the digital world to corporations expect to have pro-social goals. We actually need to think about situations where governments, communities, cooperatives build their own digital tools and infrastructures so that they serve us as a society.
So you are from the generation that grew up in the beginning of the internet. And can you tell us what you thought of internet at the time and where this technology could lead us?
Sure. I'm 50 years old. I was born in 1973. I am of a generation that started using personal computers in elementary school and high school. When we were using them, they were these huge, giant things. I learned how to program for the first time on a Commodore PET, which is about 25 kilos. It's this sort of giant box. I actually have one upstairs in my study. The internet wasn't something we encountered until we went to university. There were some services like America Online that you could participate in to get, something like email, but even those were very early. The internet, when I started working with it, was this sort of academic curiosity. I got online for the first time in 1989. And what was very interesting was it was a secret world. It was a hidden world. There were these very interesting, funny, sometimes very transgressive conversations taking place on this academic internet. And it was kind of like this great secret. You could get to this through the computer science department. You could get to it from your university computer, but people were talking about drugs. They were talking about punk music. They were talking about sexuality. And so it felt like this very strange underground world. And then in 1994, the web browser became popular. So it had been invented in 1989, but no one really knew about it. And what the web browser did is it took the internet out of this sort of command line text world, which was pretty difficult to use, and suddenly made it incredibly easy to use. And it was like this underground nightclub, you know, suddenly like sort of rising above the surface of the streets, and suddenly everybody knew about it. But that early internet, 94, 95, 96, still had this sort of aspect of secrecy to it, still had this real sense of discovery. It was weird. It was strange. Corporations were starting to figure it out, but it felt, you know, does anyone really want them here? Are they ever going to be able to get it? Are they going to be able to understand it? And obviously this all changed very, very quickly. But you have to understand, like, being into the internet in 1990 was like being into Dungeons and Dragons. Like, it was a weird, geeky subculture. It was about as far as you could get from the mainstream.
Okay, thank you. And before we get back precisely to the internet, you wrote a book about the rise of mistrust in society.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, why is trust such an important thing? And what are some of your hypotheses about the reasons of this decline?
Sure. So trust is a social, political, and economic lubricant. If you and I are in business together and we trust each other, you might send me a shipment before you even receive payment for it, because you know that I'm going to pay you and that I value the relationship and it's going to keep going. If we don't trust each other, we're going to slow down the process, and we might even need to bring in a third party, like an escrow, where you send your goods to that party, I send my money, and then that person. It slows everything down. So trust at the most basic level is something that allows society to move faster, society to move more smoothly. It's also something that allows multiple people to coordinate. If we trust an institution, we can ask that institution to do something important for us. If we trust the schools, we can jointly put our resources in through taxes, and we can educate our children. As soon as trust breaks down, you end up with tremendous potential for conflict. So in the United States right now, there's very low trust in institutions of all sorts. And a lot of this happens along partisan lines. So let's think about schools again. You have many people on the right in the United States who believe that schools are promoting an agenda of homosexuality. They are going into school boards and trying to fire librarians and fire teachers. There's enormous conflict, and it's actually very hard for the institution to do its work, in part because we don't trust the institution, or at least those people don't trust the institution. The problem in the United States, to a lesser degree in Europe, but certainly in the US, and in many parts of Europe, certainly in Southern Europe, is that trust in institutions of all sorts has declined radically pretty much from the 1970s to today. There's a bunch of hypotheses for why this might be. One is rising inequality. Systems are not working very well for many people. If you are working hard and not succeeding, and you feel like the rich are getting richer, you might have mistrust of the system. It's possible that we are better informed, that in the 1970s, the 1980s, you had a lot of journalism essentially saying, you know, the government has done this and it's great. And these days we're much more critical. We argue things on the internet. Many more people are educated. Many more people are trained in critical thinking. So it's possible that media is a piece of it. I think the most likely hypothesis is that in many cases, institutions have failed. So in the US, we can see a pattern that an institution will have a significant failure and then trust will fall off. So I'll give you two examples of this. The Catholic Church in the United States was revealed in the city of Boston to be sending pedophile priests one parish to another. So priests would abuse children, and instead of being removed from the priesthood, they would just be moved on to another parish. And the Boston Globe revealed this, and around the country, people started talking about abuse by clergy. And you can watch Americans' confidence in religion, belief in religious institutions go down. Another parallel is the banking crisis of 2007, 2008. You can see Americans' confidence in banks collapse at that point. And it turns out that trust takes decades to build up. When you lose it, it can literally take decades to recover. And so we're at a point where institutional trust in the United States is extremely low at this point, and it's extremely low in many other advanced democracies as well.
What do you think is the role of social media in the decline of trust? Do you think there is a role of social media?
So it's very fashionable to blame contemporary social problems on social media. And there's reasons why it makes sense, right? Social media can help mis and disinformation move around the world at a very fast pace. Social media seems sometimes to bring out the worst in us. It seems sometimes to blind us to the other person's humanity, and we react simply to point of view. We get very partisan. What's tricky is that most of these dynamics around trust are much older than social media. So trust in institutions in the United States was falling in the early 1970s. The internet was only invented in 1969. Social media, depending on how you define it, doesn't really emerge until the 2000s. It's hard to blame the collapse in trust on social media. There's also a lot of experimentation that people are starting to do. And these experiments suggest that social media probably isn't the whole problem. So a set of academic researchers just did a bunch of work in cooperation with Facebook. I've reviewed this work. It's sound work. I don't think Facebook is censoring it. They've done a lot of comparisons where they've basically tried to remove social media effects. They've taken people out of the algorithmic feed. And the truth is, the news they consume gets even more partisan. You know, the feed probably wasn't making them partisan. It might have been helping them from being too partisan. But the other important thing is that people's beliefs don't change. Those beliefs seem to be shaped over a long period of time, and they seem to be shaped by the overall media environment, not just by social media. Me personally, if I were to try to fix political polarization in the United States, I would be focused on news media and particularly cable television. I think in the US, highly partisan television news has probably had a much more profound force on destroying trust in public institutions than social media. We don't talk very much about it, mostly because it's ordinary, right? And so when something becomes ordinary, it's not worth talking about. We talk about social media because it's extraordinary. Wait until we have something new. You know, maybe we're all in the metaverse. We'll talk about why that is making us crazy, and we won't talk about social media anymore.
Okay, thanks. And I think it's in 2014 that you wrote an article for The Atlantic where you talked about the advertisement model of social media and why it can be a problem. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I wrote a piece in 2014, so now almost 10 years ago, talking about the idea that advertising became the default model for supporting social media. And the problem with advertising as the default model is that the incentives in an advertising supported world are to capture as much attention as possible. So if I am Facebook, what I want is to keep me on the site as long as possible so I can keep viewing ads. Secondarily, I want my user to create content about herself, both because it gives people more things to look at and because it reveals information. What does she care about? What does she think about? Those incentives, everyone should publish and everyone should spend as much time as possible here, are not necessarily aligned with the incentives of a healthy society. In a healthy society, what we want is people to know verifiable information, and we want people to have constructive debates about the future and spaces to cooperate on projects of mutual interest. It's not that the two are necessarily opposite, it's more that they're orthogonal. They're just sort of going in different directions. The problem in many ways is just that social media has been so damned popular that there have not been spaces to have these sorts of serious conversations that we'd like to have. And so what happens is we try to have these civic conversations in these social media spaces, and it doesn't really work. It would probably be easier to build those civic spaces if we had some different business models. If you subscribed to social media and you had control over what you were seeing, you could decide today, I want to waste some time, I want to see the funny stuff, or today I just want to be serious, just give me the news that I need. You know, today I want to work on this project, I want to collaborate with people on a climate change effort. If social media, if these platforms respected our intentions, it would be a very different world. But they don't work for us. We are not the customer, we are the product. And so they work for the advertiser, and therefore, much of the time, they defy our intentions.
Yes, and one of the aspects that strikes me with large social media platforms is how they are able to weaponize human nature in order to make profit. In your opinion, how could social media be more well suited to our human nature?
So I want to be a little careful here because Shoshana Zuboff developed this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And I feel like there's two things to say in this book, one of which she gets completely right, and one of which I think is exaggerated. So the first thing is that there's this model. This model is that we want to capture your attention, we want to deliver ads to you, we want to understand you as completely as possible, and that by itself has negative implications, right? If we're trying to capture your attention, and it turns out that the best way to capture your attention is by making you angry or by making you passionate, these networks can, you know, put content in front of you designed to inflame, designed to make you emotional. The second part of Zuboff's claim is that these networks have almost a magic power to persuade you to do things that you don't want to do. Zuboff really seems to believe that these networks are almost magic, that they can, sort of make you do things you don't want to do. And I think there's almost no evidence for that. I think in many ways it's taking the claims of Google or Facebook far too seriously. So I think if we take the first half of Zuboff, if we basically say these networks don't care about your mental health, they don't care about civic health. What they care about is making money through capturing your attention. That by itself is problematic enough without granting them magic power to persuade you and change your mind. And I think what we have to say is, do we accept a society in which our attention is for sale in those ways? Or do we recognize that attention is one of the most precious commodities at this point and believe that we should have a right to protect it and defend it?
Is there some platforms that exist today that could inspire us to build new social media? So I think about platforms like Reddit, Wikipedia, and some initiatives that you are actually working on.
Sure. So let's talk about some different models that I think might make for healthier social media. I think one idea is that topic-based social media might be healthier for us than what we might call big room social media. So think about Twitter, right? Back before Elon Musk started doing all these things to it. There were hundreds of different conversations going on Twitter. Over on this corner of Twitter, people are talking about anti-Black racism. Over here, people are talking about the presidential race. Over here, people are talking about the environment. And every so often, someone would yell loud enough that it would sort of capture everybody's attention. That's very powerful. It's very powerful for activists, right? If you're a Black Lives Matter activist, if you're a Me Too activist, that sort of big room is very powerful. But it's also very conflicted. It's very easy to sort of say, wait a second, this isn't my conversation. I don't want to be talking about this. So often, small room networks can be healthier. So you join Reddit and you join r/anti-work, and there's a conversation that is critical of the contemporary workplace and capitalism. And if you want to think about what it would be to work in a cooperative or to move beyond contemporary visions of work, that's a cool space for that conversation. And you're not going to have someone coming in selling cryptocurrency, right? Because they're going to try to figure out how to say, this is on topic, this is off topic. A second thing that's very valuable about those communities is that they are self-governing. So Reddit has two sets of rules. There's platform-wide rules. You can't exchange child sexual abuse material. You can't sell handguns or drugs. But then there's community-specific rules. The community might say, r/science says, you can only share peer-reviewed research. So you have to show up with a peer-reviewed paper if you want to make a point about something. Other communities might say you can't attack someone. You have to be polite. You have to be civil. And the people enforcing those rules are members of the community. That's really different from Facebook or from Twitter, where there are bots and professional moderators. It's much more human. It's much more engaged in civics. It's people learning how to govern their own spaces. I think these smaller spaces are the future. And I think these smaller spaces can be around a topic, they can be around an identity, they can be around a locality. So let me give two more examples here. A community that I take a lot of inspiration from is called an archive of one's own. This is a project started by people who write fan fiction. Fan fiction is the idea that you're sad that there aren't any more Harry Potter books, so you're going to keep writing them. Or you miss Jean-Luc Picard on the Starship Enterprise, so you're going to keep writing, episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Incredibly popular. There are tens of millions of people involved with it, largely women, as it turns out. And these women were often getting kicked off of other social media platforms because the platforms were worried about copyright. I write, an extension of Muhammad Ali versus Superman, who's sitting there over your shoulder, and suddenly someone is worried that DC Comics is going to come after me, and they kick me off of the platform. So an archive of one's own was created as a safe space for fan fiction. And it's this amazing example of what a community can do when it can make its own rules. It turns out that many people in this community are survivors of sexual abuse. And so they want to mark stories very carefully and say, if you are triggered by talk about rape, don't read this story. That's an accommodation that most social networks don't have. They don't have the tagging, they don't have the warning, but they're able to build the system around this. And the women behind this project have built a system, their own original social media platform that supports between 5 and 10 million users a month, is incredibly robust, is incredibly successful, and also sort of serves as community training. There are advocacy projects that come out of this work. There are legal defense projects that come out of this work. They've turned an online community into an activist community, a scholarly community. Another example of how small networks can work is a project in Vermont in the United States. So Vermont is one of the smallest states in the United States. It is a very unique state. It is small, rural, and very politically opinionated. It leans left politically, but it mostly leans fiercely independent. And a guy in the biggest city there started a project which was just a mailing list for his neighbors. He just wanted to be able to borrow tools or, organize a block party. It worked so well that it has now spread, and there is now a list for pretty much every neighborhood and every town in Vermont and a few bordering areas. It's called Front Porch Forum. It's sort of the anti-social network. If Facebook wants your attention for hours a day, Front Porch Forum wants 2 minutes from you. You get one email once a day. It has 4 posts in it. They've been moderated. So if someone is trying to start a political argument, they'll get a note from the moderator essentially saying, yeah, that's not what we do here. And it's very simple. It's very practical, but it works. I happen to live on the border with Vermont, and I've been a member of this community since it was started. And 4 months ago, someone said, hey, I'm helping resettle a refugee family from Haiti. I could really use some help. Do you want to come help? Come to the church. And I'm very interested in Haiti. I came to the church. I've now been involved for 4 months with resettling this Haitian family. And it's really through this local social network that turned me on to what was going on. So there really are different models possible. It's just that these models have an incredibly hard time competing against the huge volume and marketing muscle and installed user base of a Facebook, an Instagram, a Twitter, all of these different things.
You've coined the term digital public infrastructure.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So modern states invest in infrastructure. We invest in roads, railroads, hospitals, schools, courts, all these sorts of things we need so that we can have a functioning society and a functioning economy. These days, a lot of the things that we need to invest in are digital. They might be having good broadband to the home, but they also could include things like tools that help us work together, tools that help us interact via video conference, search engines that help us find information, possibly even social networks where we interact and talk with one another about political and civic issues. Different countries approach infrastructure different ways. The United States doesn't really believe in public infrastructure. We don't do it very often. We do public highways, we do public schools somewhat grudgingly. We don't do trains. We don't do a lot of things that most societies do. There's other societies, the Scandinavians, the Germans, the Dutch, who invest very heavily in public infrastructure. Generally speaking, they're happier. They're often more economically successful, but it's a very different social bargain. I am trying to get people to think about the idea that maybe infrastructure needs to include search engines. Maybe it needs to include social networks. Maybe it needs to include video conferencing. And my team at UMass has gone after one very specific part of the problem, which is social networking. And we've gone after social networking because it's a field that almost everyone can agree does not work very well and seems to have really serious civic implications, and where it seems like it's solvable. So, for instance, I actually think search engines are probably more important. I think the idea that Google, has a near monopoly on how we find information and might be influencing us politically, I think that's much more problematic. Building a public search engine is really, really hard. But building alternative social media actually isn't very hard. It's hard to get people to use it. It's not that hard to get people to build it. The analogy that I use is the analogy of public broadcasting. Most countries, most advanced democracies, invest significantly in public broadcasting. They use a public broadcaster to make sure that there's a certain baseline of accurate, verifiable information that everybody has. Many countries use public broadcasting as a way to amplify minority voices. So you live in Marseille, you have a large North African population. That North African population often doesn't get heard from in French media. That's something public media could focus on. So public media is a very powerful force, and most advanced democracies decide that it's worth investment. I'll say the US is a contrast here. We don't really have public media in the US. We have voluntary media. We support it through donation, gets very, very little government support. But you can imagine a European model for social media where public broadcasters, other public institutions are investing in small social networks, things analogous to Front Porch Forum, things that are helping local conversations take place and supporting them through taxpayer dollars in the same way that we support public broadcasting. And the logic is that we believe we need public broadcasting because we need information to be informed citizens. I would argue that we also need spaces to discuss and talk and spaces to discover information. And we might also decide that those are things that we have to provide as public goods. So that's the argument behind digital public infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And to mention one project in France that is really interesting, it's called Tallness All, and it's a collaborative research project that tries to build an alternative to the YouTube algorithm. And,
okay.
And the project seeks to find what would be the most robust method to arrive at a collective score that will indicate how much a video may be considered of public interest.
We actually investigate YouTube algorithms quite a bit. Do you know where that research is being done?
People are like scattered across France and Switzerland, but I'm on a discussion group with them. I know them quite well, so I'll send you the link if you want after that, and I can put you in contact if it's
wonderful. I would love to be in contact. I'm finding it at tallnessall.app, but yeah. I will learn more about it. But that's something I very much want to know more about. So thank you for that. Yeah.
For sure. One other question will be about Taiwan, because I found this example quite interesting. So I've made some research about Taiwan digital democracy. What is your opinion on the work that has been done in Taiwan in order to make it what we could call a kind of digital democracy? Is there some efforts that you've seen there that could inspire maybe Western societies?
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about how Taiwan has become one of the leaders in sort of digital public governance. Taiwan had a wave of public protests now about 10 years ago. And these shut down the parliament. Many different factions were involved. It was incredibly complicated. It wasn't just one issue. It was, dozens of different groups advocating for dozens of different things. What my friends in Taiwan tell me is that the two groups that everybody respected were the doctors, who sort of went around to all the different protest camps and made sure that everyone was healthy, and the internet people, who went around to all the different protest camps and made sure that everyone was connected and online. What this did was give a lot of public enthusiasm for the internet as a force for social change in Taiwan. And when the government changed to the current government, which is quite open and progressive, and also very strongly anti-mainland China, it opened space for a lot of digital experiments. Audrey Tan is a minister without portfolio, but really I think most people think of as the digital minister for Taiwan. And Audrey has been involved with many efforts to let people in Taiwan comment directly on legislation, but also to self-organize. So an example from Taiwan would be during COVID, people were trying to find masks, and someone wrote basically a Google map where you could post and say, this store has masks, this store is out. And not only did the government not shut it down, they promoted it and ended up paying the hosting bill for it. So the Taiwanese government has just gotten very good at inviting citizens to innovate and then sort of embracing that innovation. There's a movement in Taiwan called Gov0, and this is, the zero is this idea of sort of being selfless. Like, you're not putting yourself up as a leader, you're helping participate in this project. So it's a very different model for how people think of themselves as engaged citizens. You go to these conferences and you can stand next to this giant zero, and in Chinese it says, I am nobody. and that's the thing that you were proud of being. You were proud of being, you know, a nobody who's helping everything be better. But Taiwan, I think, has demonstrated that there's enormous creativity that ordinary citizens can have, and that you don't need to get 100% or even 10% of people involved with an activity for it to be civically useful. Sometimes it's really helpful to find those one or two people who are very creative and want to be involved and want to help, and have the government amplify their interventions. So I tend to think of Taiwan as one of the best laboratories for civic creativity.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. And to talk about a darker aspect of maybe algorithms, Cathy O'Neill, which is a data analyst, wrote a book called Weapons of Mass Destruction that underlines how large-scale algorithms can pose a threat to society. More globally, it seems that our society depends more and more on quantification and measurement in order to improve decision making. Sorry. Do you think there is some danger in our tendency to rely more and more on numbers to take decisions? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So Cathy with Weapons of Mass Destruction was one of the first to bring the algorithm to the forefront as an object for discussion. And, you know, in that book, she talks about an algorithm as an opinion embedded in math. And that's a very good way to think about these things. Algorithms have this sort of claim of being objective. They have this claim of truth. But what they're doing in many cases is taking an opinion or taking a history and turning it into math. So one of my favorite examples of this comes from Julia Ongwen, who's an amazing journalist in the US, founded The Markup, did a lot of work with a group called ProPublica. She led a team that did a story about a very powerful and specific algorithm called Compass. Compass is what's called a risk algorithm. So this is an algorithm used in the court system in the US state of Florida to try to decide if someone is likely to commit another crime. So, as you know, in the US, we imprison a scary amount of people, more than really anyone else in the world. We tend to imprison Black and brown people at very high rates. And one of the things that happens is you get arrested and you may be forced to stay in prison until your trial if you're viewed as being high risk. And so a judge has to make a decision. Are you risky? Are you likely to commit another crime? What Compass does is makes a bunch of guesses based on where you live and your age and things like that about whether you are high risk or not. And Julia was able to demonstrate that this algorithm is deeply racist. It is far, far more likely to judge that a Black person is likely to commit a crime than a white person. It's also wrong. It actually makes a lot of very bad predictions. It makes very bad predictions about white people who also commit crimes and suggests releasing them. What's wrong with this algorithm is not that someone racist sat down and said, I'm going to imprison all the Black people. What actually is wrong with this algorithm is that the justice system in Florida, and really in the United States as a whole, is very racist. We put more police in Black neighborhoods. So if you are a black person, you're just more likely to be arrested. There's just more police around. You're more likely to be caught for a crime. The algorithm takes that system. It takes that evidence that a lot more black people get arrested, and it turns that social reality into code. So rather than having a problem of unfair policing, now you have math. And math says, you're a black person, you're more likely to commit a crime. So this is the danger of embedding these social realities into code. And there's a huge amount of investigation now being done about this. There's a scholar named Virginia Eubanks who specializes in understanding what we might call, l'algorithme quotidien, everyday algorithms for things like social welfare payments, for housing for the unhoused, for counseling services for drug and alcohol. And she's been able to demonstrate that these algorithms often have deep unfairnesses in them and often lead particular people to be stigmatized and targeted. So there is now, thanks in part to Kathy, Julia, Virginia, all of these scholars who, by the way, are predominantly women, often women of color, there's a real focus on these questions of algorithmic justice and whether these algorithms that we're increasingly reliant on as a society, whether we are looking at them through a justice lens.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. So maybe one last question. So as our society is facing multiple crises, sometimes we refer to this situation as the meta crisis. Is there an advice you could maybe give to a young person that might watch this interview and that is thinking of a way to act in this complex situation?
I think maybe I want to give two pieces of advice. I think the first piece of advice is that problem selection is the most important decision to make. I work with researchers, and we spend an enormous amount of our time trying to figure out what problems are worth solving, we figure out that we can solve, and that would make society better if we solve them. I think a huge number of people right now are wasting their time on stupid problems. I think there's been a huge amount of innovation in the tech sector where people are trying to create Uber for X or, Amazon for Y. And I think for the most part, those are really stupid problems. I have my opinions that a lot of things around virtual reality and cryptocurrency are pretty stupid problems as well. I think there are some things that are not stupid problems. I think anything that's dealing not only with climate change, but particularly how we're going to live over the next 30 or 40 years in a rapidly changing climate, I think those are really important. I think issues of migration and refugees are incredibly important because I think a lot of us are going to be refugees really quickly. I hate to break this to you, but I don't know that Marseille is going to be all that inhabitable in another 10 years. Yeah. So I think the first thing is to say, think really hard about what you choose to give your time and attention to. Are you going to be proud of having worked on that problem and made progress on it? And then the second bit of advice, which may seem contradictory, but I don't mean it to be, is that in many ways, the most important thing is to have efficacy, to have the ability to see a change that you're making in the world. You don't have to solve global warming all by yourself. You don't have to solve distributed ledgers all by yourself. What you probably do need to do is make a contribution and feel like you've made real progress on something. And that might mean addressing a problem that's local to you. It might mean helping someone else become better at solving problems. It might mean influencing someone's thinking. It might mean participating in someone else's very worthwhile cause. So I think that question of picking problems that are really worth your attention and then approaching them in ways where you can actually see that you've achieved something, whether it's towards solving the problem or towards helping others, those are the two things that have really worked for me over the years and have helped me feel like I'm making an impact in the world.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the advice, and I think we can close the interview with this. Thank you for your time, Ethan.
Wonderful, Victor. I hope you got what you needed.
It was perfect. It was perfect.
Wonderful. Okay.
And I hope I can spread a bit more your ideas in France.
Thank you so much. Yes, I love reaching French audiences. I think actually the Europeans are more powerful than you think around a lot of these questions of the future of the internet, because there really is a different model in Europe. There's a model where the state has a role and the public has a role. And we've really let go of that in the United States. We really don't believe that in the US anymore. But people really do believe it in France. And I think, therefore, there's some really interesting creative potential. So I love talking to Europeans. I love trying to think about what a European vision of the internet could look like. I hope maybe some of these ideas are inspirational there.